Welcome to Revenge Mode. Today's story is from Chicago. My name is Meredith, and I'm 28 years old. 3 years ago, my mother called me on Christmas Eve and delivered a sentence that shattered my loyalty forever. Don't come to the meeting. Your brother doesn't see your presence as necessary. No apology, no explanation, just a cold command that erased my existence in favor of my brother's comfort. I spent that night alone in a hotel lobby in Chicago, watching strangers celebrate while I sat with a box of useless audit files. I had no idea that the older couple sitting at the next table would eventually become the parents I truly deserved. I had no idea that 3 years later, my biological parents would be standing at my wedding, staring at a nameplate that read, Meredith Vance, forcing them to ask the humiliating question, who is this person? Before I tell you how I went from being the unwanted daughter to the woman who held their fate in her hands, please take a moment to like and subscribe. But only do it if you believe that respect is thicker than blood. Also, let me know in the comments where are you watching from and what time is it there. Let me take you back to the drive that changed everything. It was December 24th. I was driving a beat-up sedan through a blinding snowstorm, gripping the steering wheel until my knuckles turned white. In the back seat sat 3 heavy boxes of financial records, the lifeline I had spent 3 sleepless nights preparing to save our family's manufacturing company from bankruptcy. I was the only one who knew the real numbers. I was the only one with a plan to stop the bank from seizing the house. My phone rang through the car speakers. Mom. I answered, immediately, relief washing over me. I'm an hour away. The roads are terrible, but I'll make it for the shareholder meeting. Turn around, Meredith. Her voice wasn't worried. It was sharp, dismissive. Excuse me. I blinked, fighting the glare of the oncoming snow. I have the restructuring plan. I found the leak in the accounts. That's exactly the problem. She cut me off. Your brother looked at the digital draft you sent. He says your numbers are too cruel. They'll scare the investors. My numbers are the truth. I shouted, my voice cracking. If we don't present this reality tonight, the bank takes everything next week. You can't hide the debt anymore. We need hope, not your harsh reality. She snapped her tone, leaving no room for negotiation. Your brother doesn't see your presence as necessary. You'll just cause trouble and embarrass him. Go back to the city. The line went dead. Silence filled the car, louder than the storm outside. I looked in the rearview mirror at the boxes of files. My hard work, my dedication, my desperate attempt to save them all dismissed because I refused to lie for the golden child. I didn't cry. I didn't scream. I simply hit the blinker, took the next exit ramp, and turned my car toward the lights of Chicago. If they didn't want my truth, they wouldn't have me. The revolving doors of the Astoria Hotel swept me out of the biting Chicago wind and into a lobby that smelled of pine needles and expensive perfume. I handed my keys to the valet, my hands still trembling slightly, not from the cold, but from the adrenaline of a life U-turning at 70 miles per hour. The clerk at the front desk didn't blink when I booked a suite for an indefinite stay, handing over my personal credit card with a practiced indifference that masked the fact that I was burning through my savings. I didn't care. I needed walls that didn't remind me of my childhood bedroom. I needed a silence that wasn't pregnant with disappointment. I didn't go up to my room. Instead, I gravitated toward the business lounge on the mezzanine level, a habit ingrained in me after 5 years of 70-hour work weeks. The space was dimly lit, populated by leather wingback chairs, and the soft hum of high-stakes commerce that never truly sleeps, even on Christmas Eve. I chose a secluded corner table near the floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the blizzard I had just escaped. A waiter appeared almost instantly, a ghost in a white vest. Double espresso, black, and a sparkling water. I ordered, my voice sounding foreign to my own ears, too calm, too detached. When the drinks arrived, I opened my laptop. It was a masochistic reflex. Even though I had been exiled, even though my own mother had told me my truth was unwanted, my brain couldn't stop processing the data. I pulled up the spreadsheets I had spent weeks refining the columns of red ink that represented my family's incompetence. I stared at the projection model for Q1 tracing the inevitable bankruptcy timeline if they proceeded with Preston's delusional revenue forecasts. They were driving off a cliff, and they had just thrown the only person with a map out of the car. I highlighted a cell containing a fraudulent tax write-off Preston had labeled miscellaneous operational expenses and pressed the delete key just to see the bottom line bleed a truer shade of red. The quiet of the lounge was shattered by a voice raised in anger. "This is absolute garbage, Sterling. You gave me your word on the valuation cap." I looked up, annoyed by the intrusion. Two men were seated 3 tables away near the fireplace. One was young, perhaps early 30s, dressed in a suit that was too trendy, too tight, and clearly designed to scream new money. He was leaning forward, his face flushed, slamming a hand onto the mahogany table. The man sitting opposite him was a study in contrast. He looked to be in his mid-60s with silver hair swept back from a face that seemed carved from granite. He wore a charcoal 3-piece suit that cost more than my car, and his posture was terrifyingly still. He didn't flinch at the younger man's outburst. He merely took a sip of his scotch, his eyes cold and unreadable. This was Sterling Vance. I didn't know him personally, but anyone in the Chicago financial district knew the face of Sterling Capital. He was a titan of industry, a man who ate startup founders for breakfast and bought distressed assets for lunch. The valuation cap was contingent on your Q4 EBITDA meeting the threshold, Mr. Holbrook. Vance said, his voice a low rumble that carried effortlessly across the room. You missed the target by 12%. Because of the supply chain adjustments. The younger man, Holbrook shouted, attracting the attention of the concierge. We agreed those were force majeure. Clause 17 in the term sheet protects my equity from external market shifts. You can't dilute my shares just because shipping containers got stuck in the Pacific. Vance sighed, a sound of profound boredom. Show me the clause then. My legal team isn't here, and frankly, I don't carry draft term sheets to holiday drinks. I don't have the physical copy, but I know what we signed. Holbrook was sweating now, his bluster failing against Vance's wall of indifference. You're trying to squeeze me out before the IPO. It's a breach of good faith dealing, and I will drag Sterling Capital through every court in Illinois for predatory lending practices. Vance swirled the ice in his glass. Without the document, Gavin, this is just noise, and I don't listen to noise. I shouldn't have intervened. The smart thing, the safe thing was to look back at my screen and let the titans clash. But then Holbrook said it again, Clause 17. My mind flashed. I knew that contract template. Sterling Capital used a standardized heavy manufacturing investment vehicle for their Series B rounds. I had audited a company 3 months ago that utilized the exact same framework. And I knew with absolute mathematical certainty that Holbrook was lying. It was the same feeling I got when I looked at Preston's fake ledgers. A physical revulsion to inaccuracy. A biological need to correct the equation. I grabbed my tablet, pulled up the legal database I subscribed to for audit research, and typed in the standard Sterling Capital term sheet query. There it was. I stood up. My legs felt heavy, but my movement was fluid. I walked across the plush carpet, the sound of my heels absorbed by the silence. Both men looked up as I approached. Holbrook looked confused. Vance looked mildly curious, like a lion watching a gazelle walk into its den. Excuse me, I said. My voice didn't shake. I placed my tablet gently on the table between them, the screen glowing blue in the dim light. Who the hell are you? Holbrook snapped. Someone who reads the fine print. I replied, not looking at him. I looked directly at Sterling Vance. He's citing the force majeure protection in Clause 17, but he's omitting the addendum in Section 409A regarding adjusted EBITDA. Specifically, paragraph C. I tapped the screen, highlighting the text. Any supply chain disruption that persists longer than 90 days is reclassified as an operational risk, not force majeure. Therefore, the valuation cap does not adjust. The 12% miss is entirely on his balance sheet, and your dilution of his equity is mathematically and legally sound. The silence that followed was absolute. Holbrook stared at the screen, his mouth opening and closing like a fish out of water. He read the paragraph I had highlighted. He knew it was there. He had just banked on Vance not recalling the specific subsection without his lawyers present. That's a standard template. Holbrook stammered, his face draining of color. That doesn't mean it applies to my specific. It is the sterling standard, Vance said softly. He hadn't looked at the tablet. He was looking at me. His eyes were sharp, intelligent, and frighteningly perceptive. And we never alter paragraph C. Vance turned his gaze back to Holbrook. You tried to bluff me, Gavin. On Christmas Eve. Holbrook grabbed his coat, his arrogance collapsing into panic. I need to check with my counsel. We'll reconvene after the holidays. Don't bother, Vance said, taking his tablet back from the table but keeping his eyes on Holbrook. The term sheet expires at midnight. Consider the deal dead. Sterling, wait. Leave. It wasn't a shout. It was a command spoken with the weight of billions of dollars behind it. Holbrook looked at me with pure venom, then turned and hurried toward the exit, his footsteps heavy and retreating. I stood there, suddenly aware of the audacity of what I had just done. I reached for my tablet. I apologize for the interruption. I couldn't listen to him misquote the tax code. Sit down. It wasn't a request. Vance gestured to the empty chair Holbrook had vacated. I hesitated. I have work to do, Mr. Vance. You have a laptop open on Christmas Eve in a hotel lounge, Vance observed, his voice dry. You are hiding from something not working. Sit. I sat. I kept my back straight, my hands folded on the table. I was used to being yelled at by powerful men. My father had prepared me well for that. But Vance wasn't yelling. He was studying me, dissecting me with the same cold precision I used on financial statements. You're not a lawyer, he stated. A lawyer would have led with a disclaimer. You led with the data. Auditor, I corrected. Forensic accounting and restructuring specialist. Name, Meredith. I didn't give my last name. It felt tainted tonight. Well, Meredith the auditor. Why did you help me? You don't know me. I could be the villain in this scenario. I am in fact diluting that boy's shares to pennies. I didn't do it for you, I said honestly. I did it because the numbers are the only thing in this world that don't lie. He was trying to twist the logic to fit his narrative. I hate it when people use emotion to obscure the math. Vance took a slow sip of his scotch. A ghost of a smile touched the corner of his mouth. Not a warm smile, but an impressed one. Emotion obscures the math, he repeated, tasting the phrase. A rare sentiment. Most people claim the math is heartless. The math is the only thing that's fair. I countered, thinking of the restructuring plan sitting in my back seat, the one my mother had rejected because it was too cruel. It doesn't care who your father is. It doesn't care who the favorite child is. It just is. If you spend more than you earn, you fail. If you ignore the clause, you lose the equity. It's the only justice that exists. Vance set his glass down. The air between us shifted. The atmosphere of the lounge seemed to fade away, leaving only the two of us and the brutal, beautiful logic we both subscribed to. You're running from a family gathering, Vance deduced. It wasn't a question. Forensic auditors don't stay at the Astoria unless they are on an expense account or running away from home. And since you didn't flinch at the price of the coffee, I assume it's your own money. I was uninvited, I said, my voice hardening. My presence was deemed unnecessary. Because you pointed out a clause they wanted to ignore. Because I pointed out a bankruptcy they wanted to pretend wasn't happening. Vance nodded slowly. He reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a heavy cream-colored card case. He slid a matte black business card across the mahogany table. It had no logo, just a name and a direct private number embossed in gold. I have a department full of MBA graduates who can recite the tax code, Vance said quietly. But they lack the instinct to kill when they see blood in the water. You saw a weakness and you struck without hesitation. That is not a skill I can teach. I looked at the card, then back at him. I'm not looking for a job, Mr. Vance. I have a career. You have a job that keeps you in a lounge on a holiday, he corrected. I'm offering you a position in my private restructuring unit. We don't save failing family businesses, Meredith. We strip them down, remove the rot, and rebuild them into weapons. Or we sell them for parts. He leaned forward slightly, his gray eyes locking onto mine. If your family doesn't see your value, perhaps it's because they are the rot. The words hit me with the force of a physical blow. They echoed the dark, treacherous thought I had been suppressing since the phone call. They are the rot. Drink your coffee, Vance said, leaning back and signaling the waiter for the check. And bring your laptop over here. If we are both going to be exiles tonight, we might as well be productive. I have a merger in Tokyo that has a discrepancy in the pension fund liabilities. I want to see if you can find it. I looked at the black card, then at the man who had just offered me a seat at a table far larger than the one I had been kicked out of. I reached out and picked up the card. It felt heavy. It felt like a weapon. I'll find it, I said. And for the first time that night, the cold ache in my chest subsided, replaced by the familiar comforting heat of a problem waiting to be solved. The view from the 45th floor of the Willis Tower usually offered a panoramic command of Chicago, but tonight the glass reflected only the exhausted faces of the board of directors sitting around the mahogany table. I didn't look at the city lights. My attention was fixed on the liquidation strategy projected on the screen, a roadmap I had designed to dismantle a 70-year-old logistics firm that had ceased to be profitable a decade ago. This is aggressive, Meredith, the opposing counsel said, loosening a tie that had been perfectly knotted 3 hours ago. You're proposing a Chapter 7 filing instead of Chapter 11 reorganization. You're talking about dissolving the pension fund. I am talking about stopping the hemorrhage. I replied, my voice steady, devoid of the hesitation that used to plague me in my father's house. The pension fund is already insolvent. If you restructure under Chapter 11, the secured creditors, specifically Sterling Capital, will bleed out another $4 million in legal fees just to delay the inevitable. We liquidate the fleet now, pay the secured debt, and let the Pension Benefit Guaranty Corporation pick up the pieces. It's the only way the employees get anything at all. I closed the folder in front of me. The sound was soft, final. Mr. Vance expects a decision by close of business, I added. Or he pulls the bridge loan and you won't even have enough cash flow to keep the lights on for the meeting tomorrow. They signed. Of course they signed. In the 18 months since I had walked out of the Astoria Hotel and into Sterling Vance's world, I had learned that fear was a far more efficient motivator than hope. I wasn't just Meredith the auditor anymore. I was Vance's scalpel, the woman sent in to cut out the rot when the patient was terminal. I took the elevator down to the lobby, the adrenaline of the kill fading into a familiar hollow exhaustion. I checked my reflection in the polished brass of the elevator doors. The woman looking back was sharper, colder. Her suit was tailored Italian wool, her hair cut into a severe professional bob. She looked nothing like the girl who had cried in a Honda Civic on Christmas Eve. But inside I was still running, still trying to put enough distance between myself and the label of unnecessary that it could never stick to me again. A black town car was waiting at the curb. I slid into the back, checking my watch. 8:00 p.m. I was late for the opening of the Millennium Park Conservatory expansion. The botanical gardens, please, I told the driver. The event was a black tie fundraiser, the kind of gathering where Chicago's elite pretended to care about horticulture while brokering zoning deals over champagne. I navigated the crowd with practiced ease, nodding to investment bankers and avoiding the gaze of corporate lawyers I had destroyed in court the previous week. I wasn't looking for networking opportunities. I was looking for the one person in this orbit who didn't care about EBITDA or asset forfeiture. I found him in the fern room, away from the noise of the main gala. Julian Vance was kneeling on the slate floor examining the root system of a staghorn fern, with the intensity most men reserved for sports cars. He was 31, with messy dark hair that defied his expensive tuxedo, and hands that were rough from working with soil, not paper. "You're going to ruin the knees of those trousers," I said softly. Julian looked up, and his face broke into a smile that always managed to disarm my defenses. It wasn't the shark-like grin of his father. It was open, genuine, and terrifyingly perceptive. "They're just clothes, Meredith," he said, standing up and brushing the dirt off his knees without a care. "But this," he gestured to the sprawling green canopy above us, "this is a 300-year-old ecosystem. It demands respect." He handed me a glass of champagne he had evidently been saving, knowing I would need it. Julian was a landscape architect, a man who built living things in a world his father sought to own. We were an unlikely pair, the destroyer and the creator, but in the lonely stratosphere of the Vance Empire, we had found a shared gravity. We were both outsiders. He was the son who refused the crown, and I was the daughter who had to forge her own. "How was the slaughter?" Julian asked, his tone teasing but his eyes searching mine for damage. "Clean," I said, taking a sip. "The logistics firm is gone. Your father will recover 90 cents on the dollar." "And what did it cost you?" "Just sleep," I lied. Julian stepped closer, taking my free hand. His thumb traced the tension in my knuckles. "My father loves you because you're efficient. He sees you as a weapon, Meredith. A very sharp, very expensive sword he can swing at his enemies." "It's better to be the sword than the victim," I countered, the old defensive reflex kicking in. "At least a weapon has a purpose. At least a weapon is necessary." "There's that word again." Julian sighed. He knew the story of the phone call. I had told him one night 6 months ago, after too much wine and a rare moment of vulnerability. "You don't have to prove them wrong anymore. You're the VP of distressed assets. You own a condo on the Gold Coast. You won." "I haven't won," I whispered, looking away from his kindness because it burned. "Winning means they admit what they lost." As if summoned by my bitterness, my phone buzzed in my clutch. It wasn't a work notification. Those had a distinct chime. This was a personal vibration, a pattern I hadn't felt in weeks. I pulled it out. The name on the screen made my stomach drop. "Mom." I shouldn't have opened it. I should have deleted it. Blocked the number, threw the phone into the fern bed. But the conditioning of 25 years is not easily broken by 18 months of success. I unlocked the screen. "Constance, I saw your name in Crane's Business Chicago. Top 40 under 40. Quite a photo. Listen, Preston is having a small liquidity issue with his supply chain vendors. Since you're working for Sterling Vance now, I assume you have access to the secondary lending markets. He needs a bridge introduction. Don't be difficult, Meredith. Family helps family. Arrange a meeting." I stared at the glowing pixels, the breath trapped in my throat. "No, congratulations. No, we miss you. No, I'm sorry we abandoned you in a blizzard. Just a demand. Just the assumption that my success was now a resource to be harvested for Preston, the very person who had deemed me unnecessary." "Meredith." Julian's voice was sharp with concern. I handed him the phone. I watched his jaw tighten as he read the message. The gentle architect vanished, replaced by a flash of the Vance temper that he usually kept buried. "The audacity," he muttered, handing the phone back as if it were contaminated. "She wants you to use your capital to bail out the brother who kicked you out. She doesn't even ask." I said, my voice trembling with a cocktail of rage and nausea. She assumes. She thinks because I made it, the slate is wiped clean. She thinks my value is finally high enough to be useful to Preston. I typed a reply. My fingers flew across the keyboard, fueled by a vindictive desire to hurt them, to dangle my power in front of their faces like raw meat. I can arrange a meeting, I typed mentally. I can make Preston beg. I can show them exactly who I have become. Don't, Julian said. He reached out and covered the screen with his hand. Why not? I snapped, pulling away. I can fix this, Julian. I can make them see me. I can make Preston sit in my waiting room for 3 hours and then reject his loan application personally. I want to see his face when he realizes I hold the keys. And then what? Julian asked quietly. Then you become my father. The accusation hung in the humid air of the conservatory. What is that supposed to mean? It means you're reacting exactly how Sterling would, Julian said, stepping into my personal space, forcing me to look at him. You're using your success as a bludgeon. If you engage with them, even to punish them, you are still playing their game. You are still letting them dictate your emotional state. Look at you, Meredith. You were the most powerful woman in Chicago 10 minutes ago. Now you're a scared little girl trying to impress a mother who is incapable of loving you. I am not scared, I hissed, though tears were pricking the corners of my eyes. You are, he said, his voice softening. You're scared that if you don't use this leverage, you really are unnecessary to them. But you have to understand something, Mir. You will always be unnecessary to people who only value parasites. Preston is a parasite. Your mother is the host. You are the cure, and parasites hate the cure. He took the phone from my unresisting fingers and locked the screen. You don't need to prove anything to them, Julian said, lifting my chin so I had to meet his eyes. You built a life out of ash. You have a career. You have respect. He paused, his thumb brushing away a traitorous tear that had escaped. And you have me. I see you. I see the woman who fixed my father's contract in a hotel lobby. I see the woman who argues about fern root systems. You are necessary to me. The fight drained out of me, leaving me shaking. I leaned into him, burying my face in the crisp fabric of his tuxedo. The smell of soil and expensive cologne surrounded me, a grounding anchor in the storm of my past. She's gaslighting me, I whispered into his chest. She acts like nothing happened. Because for her, nothing did, Julian said, holding me tighter. Narcissists rewrite history to wipe out their guilt. Don't let her hold the pen anymore. I pulled back, taking a deep breath. The conservatory air felt cleaner now. I looked at the phone in Julian's hand. I won't reply, I said. It was the hardest decision I had made in 18 months, harder than firing a CEO, harder than liquidating a pension fund. To reply was to engage. To silence was to accept that they would never change. Good, Julian said. He slipped my phone into his own pocket. Now I believe you promised to critique the structural integrity of the new Orchid Pavilion, and I promise not to talk about return on investment for at least an hour. I managed a weak smile. Julian took my arm, leading me away from the dark corner and back toward the lights of the gala. As we walked, I realized he was right. I was in danger of being swallowed by Sterling Vance's world, of becoming a creature of pure transaction. But as long as I had Julian, as long as I had someone who reminded me that worth wasn't calculated on a balance sheet, I might just survive my own success. But the text message remained in the dark, a dormant seed. They wanted a connection. They wanted access to Sterling Capital. Fine. I wouldn't give them a bridge loan. But fate, I sensed, was about to bring us into the same orbit anyway. And when that happened, I wouldn't need to seek them out. They would come to me, driven by the very greed that had made them cast me aside. The antiseptic tang of Northwestern Memorial Hospital was a sharp contrast to the humid earthiness of the conservatory where I had stood only 48 hours prior. I paced the length of the private VIP waiting room, my heels clicking a frantic rhythm on the linoleum. Inside the suite, Sterling Vance lay connected to a cardiac monitor, the victim of a transient ischemic attack, a mini-stroke, in layman's terms, or blood in the water, in the language of the sharks currently circling the boardroom of Sterling Capital. Julian sat in the corner chair, his head in his hands. He looked ill, his face pale and drawn, terrified not by his father's mortality, but by the weight of the empire threatening to crush him. "I can't do it, Meredith," he whispered, his voice rough. "The board called an emergency session for 9 a.m. Elias Thorne is going to invoke the incapacity clause. He wants to strip Dad of the chairmanship. If I walk in there, Thorne will eat me alive. I don't know the bylaws. I don't know the leverage points." "You don't have to know them," I said, stopping my pacing to look at him. "You just have to hold the line until Sterling recovers. It's a temporary proxy." "It's not temporary," Julian countered, looking up with desperate eyes. "Thorne has been waiting 5 years for a moment of weakness. If he takes the gavel today, he initiates a hostile vote to dilute the family shares. Dad loses control. Forever." The door to the suite opened. Sterling's personal attorney, a man named Arthur, oscillating between grief and panic, stepped out. "He wants to see you," Arthur said. He didn't look at Julian. He looked at me. I entered the room. Sterling Vance looked smaller against the white sheets, the left side of his face drooping slightly, a terrifying crack in the granite facade. But his eyes, gray cold and relentlessly intelligent, were blazing. He motioned for me to come closer, his speech slightly slurred but unmistakably commanding. "Thorne moves at dawn," Sterling rasped. "I know," I said, stepping to the bedside. "I've drafted a motion to delay, citing medical privacy, but Thorne has the votes to override." "Delay is death," Sterling cut me off. "We need to kill the motion. We need to vote the Class A supervoting shares." "Julian is the beneficiary," I said. "He can vote them." "Julian is a gardener." Sterling spat out the word like a curse. "Thorne will manipulate him into a concession within 5 minutes. Julian has a heart. Thorne has a calculator. It's a mismatch." He took a breath, the effort rattling in his chest. He pointed a trembling finger at the bedside table where a thick leather folio lay waiting. "Open it." I picked up the folio. Inside lay a document I recognized from my law school electives, though I had never seen one executed in high finance. It wasn't just a durable power of attorney. It was a petition for adult adoption filed in the Circuit Court of Cook County alongside a irrevocable trust amendment. "I can't entrust the voting rights of a $10 billion fund to an employee," Sterling said, watching my face. "The bylaws are specific. Class A shares can only be voted by a lineal descendant or a legal family member. If I give you power of attorney as an employee, Thorne sues for conflict of interest. If I give it to you as my daughter, he has no standing." My hands went cold. I stared at the legal jargon. Petitioner Sterling Vance. Adoptee Meredith. "This isn't just a title," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. "In the state of Illinois, this severs all legal ties to my biological parents. It issues a new birth certificate. It erases them, Sterling. Legally, they cease to exist to me. They cease to exist to you the moment they left you in a hotel lobby," Sterling countered. His weakness seemed to evaporate as he negotiated the most important deal of his life. "This is a transaction, Meredith. I need a general. You need a legacy. I am offering you the keys to the kingdom, protection, inheritance, the power to never be dismissed again." "It's extreme," I said, looking at the signature line. "It's necessary," he replied. "Necessary." The word hung in the sterile air. I closed my eyes. Instantly, the image of my phone screen flashed in the dark behind my eyelids. The text from my mother. "Preston needs a bridge introduction. Don't be difficult." She didn't want a daughter. She wanted a conduit to capital. My father Harold hadn't called in 3 years, too cowardly to defy his wife, too weak to check if I was alive. To them, I was an asset to be liquidated when convenient. Sterling Vance was offering me a transactional relationship, yes, but it was an honest one. He valued my mind. He respected my ruthlessness. He didn't ask me to shrink. He demanded I expand. He was asking me to trade a bloodline that treated me like a parasite for a lineage that treated me like a partner. I looked at Julian through the glass of the door. He was watching us, and he nodded. A slow, relieved nod. He didn't want the crown. He wanted me to take it so he could be free. I picked up the heavy fountain pen from the bedside table. "Does Arthur have a judge on standby?" I asked. "Judge Reynolds is in the hospital cafeteria." Sterling smirked, the expression lopsided but triumphant. "He owes me a favor from his re-election campaign." I uncapped the pen. I didn't hesitate. I didn't think about Christmas dinners I would never be invited to, or the childhood bedroom I would never sleep in again. I thought about the numbers. The numbers said Harold and Constance were a liability. Sterling was an asset. I signed my name, Meredith. And then next to the line for the new legal surname, I wrote it out in sharp, jagged cursive. Vance. 2 hours later, the double doors of the Sterling Capital boardroom swung open. The room was a Shark Tank in bespoke suits. Elias Thorne sat at the head of the table, Sterling's chair, feigning solemnity, while his eyes danced with victory. Around him sat 12 board members, men and women who smelled blood and were ready to feast. "The meeting is called to order," Thorne announced, his voice smooth as oil. "In light of Sterling's unfortunate incapacitation and Julian's absence, we must move to appoint an interim chairman to stabilize the stock price." "That won't be necessary, Elias," I said, stepping into the room. Thorne looked up, his lip curling in a sneer. "Meredith, the auditor. I wasn't aware we ordered coffee." "I'm not here for the coffee," I said, walking past the stunned secretary. I placed my briefcase on the table with a heavy thud. "You have no standing here," Thorne snapped. "This is a closed session for voting members and family. Security. I suggest you check the bylaws regarding Class A share representation," I said, opening the briefcase. I pulled out the court order, the ink barely dry, stamped with the official seal of Cook County. I slid the paper down the long, polished table. It stopped inches from Thorne's hand. "What is this?" Thorne asked, picking it up. As he read, the color drained from his face, leaving him a pasty, sickly gray. "A durable power of attorney," I declared, my voice projecting to the back of the room. "And a certificate of adoption. As of 8:45 this morning, I am legally Meredith Vance. I control 51% of the voting shares." A gasp went around the room. Whispers broke out like wildfire. "This is absurd," Thorne sputtered, throwing the paper down. "He's brain damaged. He was coerced." "He is lucid, and Judge Reynolds witnessed the signature," I replied calmly. "And unless you want to challenge a sitting judge in open court while the stock price tanks, I suggest you vacate that chair." Thorne didn't move. He stared at me, searching for the crack, for the hesitation of the employee he used to ignore in the elevator. He found nothing. He found only the mirror image of Sterling Vance, younger, sharper, and hungrier. "You're bluffing," Thorne hissed. "You wouldn't dare liquidate the Thorne Holdings position. It would cost the firm millions." "I liquidated a logistics firm yesterday to save $4 million in legal fees," I said, leaning over the table, my hands flat on the wood. "Do not test my appetite for collateral damage, Elias. I will burn your equity to the ground to keep this seat warm. Do you want to be wealthy, or do you want to be unemployed? Choose." The silence stretched taut as a piano wire. Thorne looked at the board members. They looked away. They were loyal to the winner, and the math had just shifted. Thorne stood up. He gathered his papers with trembling hands. "This isn't over," he muttered as he passed me. "It is for you," I said. I watched him leave. Then I turned to the empty chair at the head of the table. I sat down. The leather was still warm. I looked out at the skyline of Chicago, the city that I now owned a piece of. My phone buzzed in my pocket. Another text from Constance, likely asking why I hadn't replied about the loan. I didn't check it. I didn't block it. I simply didn't care. The woman who had birthed me was a stranger. The man who had just saved me was my father. And I had a company to run. Item 1, I said to the room. Let's review the loyalty of the current board. The Stone Creek Estate. A sprawling 300-acre property just north of Lake Forest was burning with the colors of a Midwest October. Maples and oaks formed a canopy of fire red and gold over the long winding driveway leading up to the main limestone residence that had been in the Vance family for 4 generations. It was a day designed for romance, for vows whispered under the ancient trellis in the rose garden, but the air inside the east wing hummed with a different kind of tension. I stood in the bridal suite staring at my reflection. The woman in the mirror wore a dress of ivory silk crepe architectural and severe in its elegance, designed to command attention rather than beg for it. But beneath the layers of silk, my heart was hammering a frantic rhythm against my ribs. Today, I was marrying Julian, the only man who had ever seen me as a person rather than a function. Yet in true Sterling Vance fashion, my wedding day had been dual-purposed, to maximize efficiency. Sterling had argued 3 months ago when we finalized the guest list, we are gathering 50 of the most liquid, high-net-worth individuals in the hemisphere. It would be fiscal negligence not to offer them a structured opportunity to deploy that capital before the champagne is served. So while the main lawn was being prepped for the ceremony, the library and the adjoining solarium in the West Wing, completely separated from the wedding venue, had been converted into a private equity summit. It was an exclusive ticketed event where select entrepreneurs could pitch to the Vance Circle for Series A funding. It was a Shark Tank disguised as a cocktail hour, a filter to separate the serious players from the social climbers before the real celebration began. "You're checking the Nikkei index again," a voice said from the doorway. I turned to see Julian defying tradition by seeing the bride before the altar. He looked devastating in a midnight blue tuxedo, but his eyes were warm, anchoring me to the earth. "The yen is volatile," I admitted, putting my phone down on the vanity. "And your father is currently in the West Wing holding court with 3 oil tycoons. I worry he's going to accidentally merge a pipeline deal with our wedding toasts." "Let him play emperor," Julian said, walking over to kiss my forehead. "The West Wing is soundproof. Whatever business happens, there stays there. Today in this room you are just Meredith. My wife. Not the CEO. Not the scalpel. Just you." I leaned into him, inhaling the scent of sandalwood and peace. "Just me," I repeated, trying to believe it. But 3 miles away at the heavy iron gates of the estate, 3 people were trying desperately to be anyone but themselves. A rented Lincoln town car, its black paint dull and scratched near the bumper, idled nervously at the security checkpoint. Inside, the air conditioning was blasting, but Preston was sweating through his dress shirt. He sat in the passenger seat, clutching a leather portfolio so tightly his knuckles were white. In the back, Harold stared out the window with the vacant look of a man who had long ago surrendered his agency, while Constance applied a fresh coat of lipstick with a hand that trembled ever so slightly. "Remember the narrative," Preston hissed, turning to look at his parents. "We are facing a temporary liquidity crunch due to rapid expansion in the Asian markets. The underlying assets are solid. We just need a bridge loan to unlock the inventory." "It's a lie, Preston," Harold murmured, his voice cracking. "We don't have inventory. We have warehouses full of rusted parts and a foreclosure notice on the factory." "Shut up, Harold," Constance snapped, snapping her compact shut. "Do you want to live in a motel? Because that is exactly where we are going if we don't walk out of here with a check. This creates confidence. Confidence creates capital. We are simply borrowing against future success." The security guard, a man with a military bearing and no sense of humor, tapped on the window. Preston rolled it down, flashing a smile that was all teeth and panic. "Invitation?" the guard asked. "We purchased 3 platinum access passes," Preston said, handing over the QR codes on his phone. They had cost $15,000, the literal last drops of the company's operating account drained this morning in a Hail Mary pass that would either save them or send them to federal prison. "The names are under Thatcher Manufacturing. We're here for the Vance Capital Summit." The scanner beeped. The guard looked at the screen, then back at the car. He didn't smile. To him, they were just another set of desperate pleaders coming to kiss the ring. "Park in Lot B, proceed directly to the West Wing entrance. Do not deviate to the main grounds. The gardens are closed for a private event." "Of course," Preston said, his voice pitching too high. "Strictly business." As the gate swung open, the car rolled forward onto the gravel. They drove past the manicured lawns, past the fountains that sprayed water into the golden sunlight. They saw white tents in the distance, floral arrangements being carried by staff, and the distinct bustle of a massive celebration, but in their desperation, they misinterpreted the signs. "Look at this," Constance whispered, greed sharpening her features as she gazed at the estate. "Sterling Vance really knows how to treat his investors. This must be the gala reception for the summit. If we play this right, we'll be drinking champagne with billionaires by sunset." They parked the sad rental car between a Bentley and a custom Rolls-Royce. As they stepped out, the disparity was brutal. Preston's suit was off the rack and ill-fitting. Constance's dress was a season too old. Harold looked like he was wearing a costume for a play he didn't understand. They walked toward the West Wing entrance, their footsteps crunching on the gravel, 3 imposters entering the lion's den. Inside the solarium, the atmosphere was thick with the scent of money, expensive cologne, aged scotch, and the subtle metallic tang of ambition. A dozen groups were huddled in conversation, pitch decks open on high-top tables. Waiters circulated with trays of hors d'oeuvres that cost more than the Thatcher family's weekly grocery bill. Preston grabbed a glass of whiskey from a passing tray and downed it in one gulp. "Okay," he muttered, wiping his mouth. "We need to find Sterling Vance. We don't waste time with the junior associates. We go straight to the top." "Is that him?" Constance asked, pointing toward a group near the fireplace. Sterling Vance stood there, looking older than his photos, but radiating a power that made the air around him seem thinner. He was laughing at something a Saudi prince had said, looking relaxed, victorious. "That's him," Preston said. He opened his portfolio, checking the documents one last time. The papers inside were a work of fiction. Preston had taken the disastrous numbers Meredith had warned them about 3 years ago and simply erased them. He had inflated the revenue by 40%, hidden the debts in offshore shell accounts that didn't exist, and forged an audit opinion from a mid-tier accounting firm. It was bank fraud. It was securities fraud. It was a felony on paper. But to Preston, it was just creative accounting. "He looks happy," Harold noted, squinting at Vance. "Why is he wearing a white rose?" "Who cares?" Preston snapped. "He's rich. Rich people wear flowers. Now listen. Mom, you talk about the legacy. Dad, you nod and look dignified. I talk numbers. If he asks about the audit, we say the auditor is pending final review." Constance recited the lie she had practiced in the car. They took a breath, a collective inhale of 3 people standing on the edge of a cliff. They didn't know that the man they were targeting wasn't just a potential investor. They didn't know he was the man who had adopted the daughter they threw away. They didn't know that the private event in the gardens was the wedding of the girl they had deemed unnecessary. They stepped into the circle. "Mr. Vance." Preston interrupted, his voice booming slightly too loud in the refined acoustic space. Sterling Vance stopped laughing. He turned slowly, his gray eyes landing on the 3 strangers who had breached his perimeter. He didn't recognize them. Why would he? To him, they were just faces in a sea of applicants, 3 more beggars at the gate. "I am currently speaking," Vance said, his voice a low rumble of warning. "I apologize, sir." Preston rushed on, oblivious to the social cue. "I'm Preston Thatcher, CEO of Thatcher Manufacturing. We secured a platinum access pass to speak with you about a unique opportunity in domestic supply chain logistics. High yield, low risk." Vance looked at the cheap suit, the desperate sweat on Preston's upper lip, the terrified eyes of the older man behind him. He had seen this look 1,000 times. It was the look of prey, pretending to be a predator. "Thatcher." Vance repeated the name, sparking a faint, unrecognizable synapse in his memory, but he didn't make the connection. Not yet. The name was common enough. "My team handles the intake, Mr. Thatcher. I am here to enjoy the afternoon." "Sir, please." Constance stepped forward, using the charm that had worked on her husband for 30 years, but bounced uselessly off Sterling Vance. "We've come a long way. We represent a family legacy. Just 5 minutes. We have the financials right here." She gestured to Preston's portfolio. Vance glanced at his watch. The ceremony was starting in 20 minutes. Meredith would be walking down the aisle. He wanted to clear the room. He wanted these parasites gone so he could watch his daughter, his real daughter, get married. 5 minutes, Vance said, his eyes narrowing. "But this is not a charity, Mrs. Thatcher. If your numbers don't sing, you leave, immediately." "They sing," Preston promised, his hands shaking as he unzipped the portfolio. "They are perfect." He pulled out the sheaf of papers, the lies printed on heavy bond paper, and handed them to the man who had taught Meredith everything she knew about spotting a fake. "Domestic growth is up 30%. Preston began his pitch, the rehearsed lies spilling out. "We have secured contracts in the tri-state area." Vance opened the folder. He didn't look at Preston. He looked at the balance sheet. His eyes scanned the columns with the speed of a microprocessor. He flipped the page. He looked at the cash flow statement. He looked at the audit signature. And then he stopped. Because Sterling Vance didn't just know numbers. He knew Meredith's numbers. He remembered the restructuring plan she had drafted as a sample case study during her first week at the firm, a case study based on a failing manufacturing company with heavy debt and incompetent management. He looked up. The cold indifference in his eyes was gone, replaced by a dawn of recognition that was sharper and deadlier than any blade. "Thatcher," Vance said again. This time the word wasn't a question. It was an indictment. "Yes, sir." Preston smiled, thinking he had hooked the whale. "A proud family name." "I'm sure it is," Vance said softly, closing the folder but keeping his hand on it. He didn't throw them out. A cruel, calculating amusement began to glitter in his eyes. "You know, Mr. Thatcher, I have a specialist who reviews domestic manufacturing deals for me. She has a very personal interest in this sector. I think she needs to see this." "We would be honored." Constance beamed, clutching her handbag. "Is she here?" "She is," Vance said. "She's in the main hall. Why don't you join me? We were just about to start the main presentation." "We'd be delighted," Preston said, practically vibrating with relief. Vance gestured to the security guards. "Escort these guests to the grand ballroom, front row." As the family walked away, guided by the guards grinning at each other in triumph, Vance picked up his phone. He sent a single text message to the bridal suite. 3 guests. Incoming. The past has arrived to settle the tab. He pocketed the phone and followed them, a wolf shepherding sheep, to the slaughterhouse. They walked through the connecting corridor, leaving the smell of business behind and entering the scent of roses and lilies, walking blindly toward the one person in the world who knew exactly what those numbers in the portfolio were really worth. The double doors connecting the West Wing solarium to the grand ballroom were made of solid oak, reinforced with soundproofing material so dense that not a whisper of the celebration had leaked into the investor meeting. When the security guards pushed them open, the transition was jarring. The stale air of the solarium, heavy with desperation and cheap cologne, was instantly replaced by a cool breeze carrying the scent of thousands of white roses. The dim lighting of the business summit gave way to the golden glow of crystal chandeliers suspended from a vaulted ceiling that soared 40 feet overhead. Harold stumbled slightly as he crossed the threshold, his eyes adjusting to the brilliance. The space was cavernous, filled with round tables draped in heavy linen, each set with silver chargers and crystal stemware that caught the light like diamonds. A string quartet was playing something classical and serene in the corner, a stark contrast to the frantic pounding of Preston's heart. "This is it," Preston whispered to Constance, his voice trembling with a mixture of greed and awe. "This is where the real deals happen. Look at these people." He scanned the room. It wasn't just wealthy. It was powerful. He recognized the governor of Illinois chatting near the bar. He saw the CEO of a major tech conglomerate laughing with a famous venture capitalist. These were the titans of industry, the people who moved markets with a phone call, and Preston Thatcher, a man with a forged audit and a maxed-out credit card, was walking among them. He clutched his leather portfolio tighter as if it were a shield. "Act like you belong," Constance hissed, straightening her spine. She smoothed the skirt of her dated dress, forcing a smile that didn't reach her terrified eyes. "Sterling Vance invited us personally. We are guests of honor." They were ushered by the security team not to a table in the back, but down the long central aisle toward the front of the room. The guests were already seated, a sea of tuxedos and designer gowns turning to watch them. Constance mistook their curiosity for admiration. She nodded regally to a woman she didn't know, unaware that the woman was looking at her shoes with pity. "Front row," the guard said, pointing to 3 empty chairs positioned slightly off to the side, dangerously close to the dais where a microphone stand waited. "Front row," Preston echoed, practically giddy. "He's going to announce the partnership. He's going to tell everyone he's backing Thatcher Manufacturing." They sat down. Harold looked around nervously, pulling at his collar. "Preston," he murmured. "This looks like a wedding. There are flowers everywhere. Why would he announce a business deal at a wedding?" "It's a merger, Dad." Preston scoffed, dismissing his father's concern as senility. "Rich people marry companies all the time. It's symbolic. Just shut up and look successful." The lights dimmed. The string quartet stopped playing. A hush fell over the room, the kind of silence that commands absolute attention. Sterling Vance stepped up to the microphone. He had changed. Gone was the shark-like intensity of the investor meeting. He looked softer, yet somehow more imposing. He wore a tuxedo with a white rose pinned to the lapel, matching the thousands of blooms that decorated the hall. He looked out at the crowd, his eyes scanning the faces of his friends, his partners, his rivals. And then, for a brief second, his gaze flickered to the front row, landing on the 3 strangers he had personally escorted into the lion's den. A small, cold smile touched his lips. "Ladies and gentlemen," Sterling began, his voice amplified and rich, filling every corner of the room. "Thank you for joining us today. We have gathered to celebrate a union. But before we proceed to the vows, I have a special introduction to make." Preston leaned forward, his heart hammering against his ribs. This was it. The shout-out. The endorsement. He prepared to stand up and wave. "For years," Sterling continued, "I have searched for someone capable of carrying the legacy of Sterling Capital into the next century. I needed someone with vision, someone with integrity. Someone who understands that the true value of a company isn't in its assets, but in its truth." Constance squeezed Harold's hand so hard her nails dug into his skin. Vision, integrity. Those were the words she used to describe Preston in her Christmas letters. "I found that person 3 years ago," Sterling said. "She came to me not with a handout asking for favors, but with a solution to a problem I didn't know I had. She proved that blood is not what makes a family. Loyalty is. Competence is." He paused. The room held its breath. "It is my distinct honor," Sterling's voice swelled with pride to introduce the Chief Operating Officer of the Vance Trust, the future managing partner of Sterling Capital, and the most beautiful bride I have ever had the privilege of walking down an aisle. Preston froze. Bride. My daughter. Sterling announced, Meredith Vance. The double doors at the far end of the ballroom swung open. A collective gasp went through the room, followed by thunderous applause. But in the front row, time stopped. The sound of clapping faded into a dull roar like blood rushing in ears. Preston dropped his portfolio. It hit the floor with a heavy slap, the forged documents inside spilling out slightly onto the pristine carpet. He didn't notice. He couldn't move. He stared at the woman standing in the doorway, framed by the backlight like an avenging angel. She was wearing white. Not the simple practical clothes she used to wear when she did their taxes for free on weekends. She wore a gown of silk and lace that hugged her silhouette, a masterpiece of couture that cost more than the Thatcher family home. Her hair was swept up, revealing the diamonds glittering at her throat, diamonds that caught the light and threw it back with blinding intensity. But it was her face that shattered them. It was Meredith. The sister Preston had mocked. The daughter Constance had dismissed. The girl Harold had ignored. But it wasn't the Meredith they knew. That Meredith walked with her head down, apologizing for taking up space. This woman walked with the grace of a queen entering her throne room. She held her head high, her eyes scanning the crowd with a cool, terrifying confidence. She wasn't looking for approval. She commanded it. She began to walk down the aisle. No. Constance breathed the word escaping her lips like a dying prayer. That can't be. Meredith. Preston stammered, his brain misfiring, unable to reconcile the image of his discarded sister with the Titan Sterling Vance had just described. She's the COO. She's the daughter. The reality hit him with the force of a physical blow. The specialist Vance had mentioned. The one who knew domestic manufacturing. The one who needed to see their numbers. It was her. She was the gatekeeper. She was the bank. She was the judge, jury, and executioner of their fate. As Meredith drew closer, the applause grew louder. She walked past the rows of billionaires, past the senators and the CEOs, who all smiled at her with genuine respect. They didn't see a scapegoat. They saw a peer. And then she reached the front. She stopped. She wasn't looking at Julian, who stood at the altar waiting for her with love in his eyes. She wasn't looking at Sterling, who held out his hand to receive her. Slowly, deliberately, she turned her head. Her gaze landed on the three people sitting in the front row. The room seemed to drop in temperature. The smile didn't leave her face, but it didn't reach her eyes. Her eyes were arctic. She looked at Preston, sweating in his cheap suit with his fraudulent papers at his feet. She looked at Constance, whose face was a mask of horror and envy. She looked at Harold, who was shrinking into his chair as if trying to disappear. She didn't speak. She didn't need to. Her silence was louder than any scream. It stripped them naked in front of the most powerful people in Chicago. It said, I see you. I see your lies. And you are nothing. She's the boss. Preston whispered, his voice cracking, the terrifying realization finally sinking in. She's the final boss. Meredith held their gaze for 3 seconds, an eternity. Then, with a slight dismissive turn of her head, she looked away. She erased them from her vision. She took Sterling Vance's arm, and together the father and daughter of the Vance empire stepped up to the altar, leaving the Thatcher family sitting in the dust of her train, drowning in the realization that the bridge they had come to burn was actually the only ground left standing. The silence that settled over the grand ballroom was heavier than the crystal chandeliers suspended above us. The officiant, a venerable judge who had sworn Sterling into his chairmanship 30 years ago, cleared his throat to begin the invocation, but the air was already fractured. The tension radiating from the front row wasn't just palpable. It was audible, a low-frequency hum of panic that clashed violently with the serenity of the altar. I stood next to Julian, my hand resting lightly in his. I could feel the tremor in his fingers, not from fear, but from the urge to protect me. He shifted his weight, preparing to step between me and the three ghosts from my past, who sat 10 feet away staring at me as if I were a hallucination. I squeezed Julian's hand once, a silent command. Stand down. This is my audit. Preston was vibrating. I could see it from the altar. His survival instinct, warped by a lifetime of entitlement, was misfiring. He didn't see a sister who had overcome abandonment. He saw a golden ticket that was about to expire. He saw the managing partner of Sterling Capital, the gatekeeper to the liquidity he desperately needed, about to pledge herself to a life that didn't include him. If the vows were spoken, the door would close. He had to jam his foot in the jam before the lock clicked shut. We are gathered here today. The judge began, his voice solemn. Wait. The shout cracked the ceremonial atmosphere like a gunshot. Preston surged up from his chair, ignoring the gasp that rippled through the gallery of senators and CEOs. He didn't look at the security detail moving in from the perimeter. He scrambled over the silk rope separating the guests from the altar, clutching the scattered pages of his portfolio that he had hastily scooped up from the floor. Meredith. He yelled, his voice cracking with a manic, desperate hope. Meredith. It's me. It's Preston. Julian stepped forward, his jaw set in a line of granite blocking Preston's path 3 steps from the dais. Security. Julian commanded, his voice low and dangerous. No. Preston tried to shove past Julian, thrusting the crumpled papers forward like a shield. She needs to see this. We're family. Meredith, tell them. Tell them who we are. Constance was standing now too. She didn't rush the altar, her vanity wouldn't allow her to look so undignified, but she projected her voice with the stage mother theatrics she had perfected during my childhood. Meredith, darling. She called out, a smile plastered on her face that looked like a rictus of terror. Don't let them treat your brother this way. We're here to celebrate you. We're here to sign the partnership. The security guards, 2 massive men who looked like they were carved from concrete, grabbed Preston by the arms. He thrashed, scattering the fraudulent balance sheets across the white rose petals that carpeted the aisle. Let me go, Preston screamed. I'm the brother of the bride, Meredith. Look at the numbers. The deal is perfect. Just tell Dad, tell Sterling to sign off. Stop. I didn't shout. I didn't raise my voice. I simply spoke the word into the microphone that was intended for my vows. The sound system carried the syllable to the back of the room, crisp and absolute. The guards froze. Preston stopped struggling, panting heavily, his eyes wild and fixed on me. The room fell into a deathly stillness. 500 of the most powerful people in the Western Hemisphere watched, waiting to see if the bride would break, if the daughter would crumble. I let go of Julian's hand. I stepped down from the dais. My dress rustled softly, the only sound in the cavernous hall. I walked toward Preston, who stood pinned between the guards, sweating through his cheap suit. I looked at the papers scattered at his feet, the deal he had brought to my wedding. I knelt down. The movement was fluid, deliberate. I picked up a single sheet of paper. It was the profit and loss statement for the last fiscal quarter. I stood up and scanned the document. Meredith. Preston breathed, a look of salvation washing over his face. I knew you'd look. I knew you still cared about the numbers. It's a bridge loan, Mer. Just $50,000 to float us until the Asian contracts hit. That's all we need. You can authorize it. You're the COO. I looked at the number he was referencing. Accounts receivable. $2 million, I read aloud. My voice was calm, the professional cadence I used in boardrooms when dissecting a failed merger. I looked up at Preston. That's interesting, because 3 days ago I ran a credit check on Thatcher Manufacturing through the Sterling database. Your accounts receivable isn't $2 million. It's 0. The Asian contracts don't exist, Preston. You fabricated the purchase orders using a shell company registered in the Cayman Islands. That's not a projection. That's wire fraud. The color drained from Preston's face so fast he looked like a corpse. That's a clerical error," he stammered. The auditors... The auditors are fictitious." I interrupted, flipping to the signature page. "Smith and Wesson, LLP, that firm dissolved 5 years ago. You forged the stamp." I dropped the paper. It fluttered to the ground, landing on his polished shoe. "You didn't come here to celebrate me," I said, my voice devoid of anger, devoid of sadness, holding only the cold weight of facts. "You came here to commit a felony in front of the governor of Illinois." Constance stepped forward, her hands clasped in a pleading gesture. "Meredith, please, don't be dramatic. Your brother is under a lot of stress. We just wanted to be part of your success. We're your parents. We made you who you are." "You did," I agreed, turning my gaze to her. "You absolutely did." I took a step closer, closing the distance until I could smell the fear radiating off them. "3 years ago on Christmas Eve, I tried to show you the truth," I said. "I brought you a restructuring plan that would have saved the house. I offered you my labor, my expertise, and my loyalty. And you," Constance told me, "to turn around." I looked at Harold, who was weeping silently, his shoulders shaking. "Do you remember the reason?" I asked softly. Harold couldn't speak. He just shook his head. "You said my presence was unnecessary," I reminded them, the word echoing off the vaulted ceiling. "You said I was a risk. You said Preston was the future and I was just an obstacle to his comfort." I gestured to the room around us, to the billionaires, the power brokers, the empire I now helped rule. "I am the managing partner of a $10 billion fund," I stated. "I decide which assets are viable and which are toxic. I decide what is necessary." I looked at Preston, who was now trembling violently in the grip of the guards. "This morning you walked into my wedding with a forged document attempting to solicit capital from my father under false pretenses. In the business world, that is called a liability." I turned to Constance. "You attempted to leverage a biological connection you severed 3 years ago to gain access to a social circle you haven't earned. That is called a bad investment." I took a deep breath, feeling the last tether of guilt snap. The little girl who wanted her mother's approval didn't exist anymore. She had died in a hotel lobby in Chicago. The woman standing here was Meredith Vance. "Mr. Harold, Mrs. Constance," I said, using the formal titles of strangers. "You claimed I was unnecessary. Today I am returning the assessment. Your presence here is unauthorized. Your proposal is rejected. And your relationship with this family is..." I paused, letting the word hang there, a guillotine blade waiting to drop. "Liquidated." I turned to the head of security. "These individuals are trespassing. Remove them. And forward these documents to the district attorney's office for review. I believe they will find the fraud quite compelling." "Meredith, no!" Constance screamed, her dignity finally shattering. "You can't do this. I'm your mother." "You were an incubator." Sterling Vance's voice cut through the noise. He stepped down from the altar to stand beside me, placing a hand on my shoulder. "Meredith is my daughter. And we have a strict policy regarding intruders." "Get them out," Julian added, his voice cold steel. The guards moved. It wasn't gentle. They hauled Preston back by his collar as his legs gave out. Another guard took Constance by the elbow, forcing her to turn away from the paradise she had tried to crash. Harold followed, head bowed, a broken man walking into the ruins he had allowed his wife to build. "Meredith," Preston wailed as he was dragged down the aisle, the guests recoiling from him as if he were contagious. "You can't leave us with nothing. We'll lose the house. We'll lose everything." I watched them go. I watched them disappear through the double doors, back into the darkness of the solarium, back to the rental car and the bankruptcy that awaited them. I felt nothing. No triumph. No sorrow. Just the clean, quiet satisfaction of a balanced ledger. The doors swung shut. The silence returned, but this time it wasn't heavy. It was light. It was free. I turned back to the altar. I looked at the guests who were staring at me with a mixture of shock and awe. I didn't apologize. I didn't explain. I simply nodded to the string quartet. "Please," I said calmly. "Continue." I walked back to Julian. He took my hands, his thumbs brushing over my knuckles. "Are you okay?" he whispered. I looked at the space where they had stood, now empty except for a few scattered papers. "I'm perfect," I said. "The audit is complete." The judge cleared his throat, looking at me with a newfound respect bordering on reverence. "Shall we proceed with the vows?" he asked. "Yes," I said, my voice steady and sure. "I'm ready to start my life." The ceremony resumed, but the atmosphere had shifted. It was no longer just a wedding, it was a coronation. And as I spoke the words that bound me to the Vance family, I knew that the purge was final. The rot had been cut away. The wound was cauterized. And for the first time in 28 years, the numbers finally added up. The Chicago winter had returned, wrapping the city in a blanket of gray and white that muted the constant roar of traffic below. From my office on the 45th floor, the snowflakes looked like suspended dust motes drifting aimlessly against the reinforced glass. It had been 60 days since the wedding at the Stone Creek estate. 60 days since I had stood at an altar and watched my past be escorted out by security. 60 days of silence. On my desk sat a thick, spiral-bound dossier stamped with the seal of the United States Bankruptcy Court for the Northern District of Illinois. It was the final trustee's report for In re Thatcher Manufacturing. I hadn't asked for it, but Arthur Sterling's attorney had forwarded it to me as a matter of due diligence. It lay unopened next to my morning espresso, a physical tombstone for a legacy built on lies. I didn't need to open it to know what was inside. The legal grapevine in Chicago was efficient. I knew that the Chapter 7 liquidation order had been signed 2 weeks ago. There was no restructuring, no reorganization, no mercy. The inventory, what little existed, had been sold for scrap. The machinery had been auctioned off to a competitor in Ohio. The brand name, tarnished by the allegations of wire fraud that the district attorney was currently investigating, was deemed worthless. I took a sip of coffee, the bitter warmth grounding me. I knew, too, what had become of the shareholders. Harold and Constance had been evicted from the family home in Naperville 7 days ago. The bank had foreclosed on the property the moment the mortgage payments stopped, and without Preston's fictitious bridge loan, the default was immediate. They were now living in a 2-bedroom rental in a nondescript complex near the airport, a place where the sound of jet engines would drown out their arguments. Preston was staying on their couch, his engagement broken, his reputation incinerated, awaiting a grand jury summons that would likely result in a federal indictment. They were trapped in a hell of their own, making a claustrophobic cycle of blame and regret. Constance blamed Harold for not working harder. Harold blamed Preston for the fraud. Preston blamed me. But their blame couldn't reach me up here. It was just noise filtered out by the double-paned glass of my new life. A soft knock on my office door broke my reverie. "Come in," I called out, turning away from the window. Elena, my executive assistant, stepped inside. She was young, ambitious, and terrifyingly organized, a mirror image of who I had been 5 years ago before the cynicism set in. She held a glossy catalog in her hands, her expression hesitant. "Ms. Vance," Elena said, placing the catalog on my desk. "The Cook County Sheriff's sale list for next month just came in. I flagged something I thought you might want to see." I looked down. It was a real estate auction catalog. A bright yellow sticky note marked page 14. I flipped to the page. There it was. Lot 42, 4-bedroom, 3-bath colonial. Naperville. Foreclosure. Starting bid $450,000. It was the house I grew up in. The brick facade looked weary, the landscaping overgrown. I stared at the photo. I remembered the window on the second floor, my bedroom where I had spent countless nights studying tax codes while Preston played video games downstairs. I remembered the dining room table where I had been told to keep quiet. I remembered the driveway where I had parked my car 3 years ago before turning around in a blizzard. The starting bid is well below market value, Elena said softly. I know it's personal. I thought perhaps you might want to acquire it. You could renovate it, flip it, or just keep it. I ran my finger over the glossy photo. To buy it would be the ultimate power move. I could buy the roof that Constance had kicked me out from under with a single bonus check. I could turn it into a rental property or a storage facility or simply let it sit empty as a monument to my victory. It was tempting. The old Meredith, the one who craved validation, would have bought it just to dangle the deed in front of them. But as I looked at the image, I realized something profound. I felt absolutely nothing. The house wasn't a trophy. It was just a pile of bricks and drywall. It didn't hold my history. It held my captivity. Buying it wouldn't be a victory. It would be an anchor. It would mean keeping a piece of them in my portfolio, a line item that I would have to think about, manage, and insure. No, I said, closing the catalog with a firm snap. Elena looked surprised. Are you sure the equity potential is significant? It's not about the equity, Elena, I said, sliding the catalog toward the edge of the desk ready for the recycling bin. It's about the inventory cost. Some assets are too toxic to hold no matter how cheap the acquisition price. So you don't want it for the memories? I looked back out the window where the snow was falling harder, now covering the city in a fresh, clean sheet of white. Not necessary, I said, the words tasting sweet on my tongue. My memories aren't in that house. My trauma is. And I liquidated that asset 60 days ago. The future is the only thing I'm interested in owning. Elena nodded, understanding dawning in her eyes. She picked up the catalog. I'll shred it. Thank you. As she left, the elevator doors in the private lobby opened. Julian walked in, shaking snow from his wool coat. He looked flushed, happy, carrying a blueprints tube under one arm and a paper bag from my favorite bakery in the other. I come bearing gifts, he announced, dropping the bag on my desk. Croissants fresh from the oven, and the preliminary sketches for the new rooftop garden at the children's hospital. He kissed me, his lips cold from the winter air, but his presence radiating warmth. He saw the unopened bankruptcy dossier on my desk. He paused, his smile fading slightly. Thatcher Manufacturing, he asked. Closed, I said. Chapter 7, it's done. And the house? Up for auction. Julian watched me carefully. Do we need to talk about it? No, I said, standing up and walking around the desk to join him. I took his hand, looking at the man who had stood by me when I had nothing but a laptop and a grudge. We need to talk about where we're going for dinner with your parents tonight. Sterling texted me. He wants to discuss the Asian market expansion. Julian laughed, the sound filling the quiet office. Of course he does. The man recovers from a stroke and immediately tries to conquer a continent. He's ambitious. I smiled, leaning my head on his shoulder. It runs in the family. I suppose it does, Julian agreed, wrapping his arm around me. And what about you, Mrs. Vance? What's your ambition today? I looked at the reflection of us in the glass, a power couple, a team, a family. I thought about the empty chair at the Thatcher dinner table, the silence of the phone. I no longer checked the peace that came from finally putting down the heavy burden of trying to be enough for people who were empty. My ambition, I said softly, is to never look back. I turned away from the window, away from the city, away from the past. I picked up the croissant and the blueprints. Show me the garden, I said. Let's build something new. Final message. If you are watching this and you have ever felt like the unnecessary person in your own family, if you have ever been the scapegoat, the fixer, or the one who is only called when there is a crisis to solve or a bill to pay, I want you to hear this. Biology is an accident of birth. It is a biological lottery that you did not choose to enter, but family is a decision. There is a dangerous myth we are told from childhood that we owe our loyalty to the people who share our DNA regardless of how they treat us. We are told to keep the peace at the expense of our own sanity. We are told to swallow the disrespect because they are still your parents. That is a lie. You do not owe your presence to people who do not value your existence. You do not owe your success to people who tried to sabotage your journey. And you certainly do not owe a seat at your table to anyone who wouldn't let you sit at theirs when you were hungry. Meredith's story isn't just about revenge. Revenge is hollow. If she had bought that house, if she had used her power to torment them, she would still be trapped in their orbit. Her true victory wasn't in destroying them. It was in becoming indifferent to them. It was in realizing that she didn't need their apology to be whole. The most powerful thing you can do to a toxic family is not to fight them. It is to render them irrelevant. It is to take the love, the talent, and the energy you wasted trying to please them and invest it into people who actually see you. Build your own empire. Choose your own name. Find your own Vance family. And when the ghosts of your past come knocking looking for a handout or a second chance, you have the right to look them in the eye and say, "You are not necessary," because the only thing that is truly necessary is your own peace. Thank you for listening to Meredith's story. If this resonated with you, if you are building your own empire from the ashes, please like, subscribe, and share this video. Let's remind every scapegoat out there that they are the hero of their own life. Until next time, keep building.